Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to give an update about HBAR and how it's performing relative to some of our expectations. Like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there. So let's go ahead and jump right into the data. What I want to start off with is something a bit different than I've talked about with HBAR before. And that's starting to talk about what is the HBAR's fair value, and can we actually model that using some quantitative models. So that's what I want to jump into here first. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up some custom charts that I made here. And with fair value, if you've seen some of my other videos about fair value on the channel, you know that there's different ways that you can quantify it, right? And one way that a lot of people use to assess fair value is this kind of time-based fair value model. And so the assumption underlying this model for HBAR is that HBAR's growth is going to follow this logarithmic growth curve. So basically, fast acceleration at the beginning, fast upward explosion. And then the slope of that growth will start to slow down over time. Bitcoin has this type of growth trajectory. Ethereum has this type of growth trajectory. So I think it's reasonable to apply this to an asset like HBAR as well. Now, obviously, that's an assumption. One could assume a linear growth trend, but I'm going to stick with logarithmic because that's the way that most crypto assets, or at least successful crypto assets, have behaved so far. So if you look at a time-based, fair value line, one of the things is that, because it's just a logarithmic curve, it's just kind of fitting it to wherever it fits best in the data. That's what this model is doing. And what it can do is it can tell you relative to that trend, is price currently above it or below it? And so, unsurprisingly right now, given how HBAR, up through this point was really exploding, and then now is coming back down, we're undervalued relative to the time-based fair value by quite a hefty margin. I mean, we're as undervalued now, really or we may even be more undervalued now than we've ever have been if we just look at the past here. But importantly, time-based fair value models are not the only way to do this, and I actually like ones that take into account additional factors. And one of the things I think makes a lot of sense for an altcoin like HBAR is let's go ahead and look at what its fair value is relative to Bitcoin and Ethereum. We know that altcoins like HBAR tend to be heavily correlated with the big crypto assets, Bitcoin and Ethereum. Price movements tend to be quite heavily kind of dependent or correlated to the market movements that Bitcoin and ETH show. So therefore, can we get a better sense of what HBAR's fair, current price maybe should be or should be expected to be based on what Bitcoin and Ethereum are doing? So what I've gone ahead and done with this model I'm showing you here now is I've basically included Bitcoin's price and Ethereum's price, or I should say the log of Bitcoin's price and Ethereum's price, as a predictor of HBAR's price, or I should say HBAR's logarithmic price. And that's what you come up with here, this red line here. This is the predicted levels of HBAR's price across time when you account for Bitcoin and Ethereum. So you're including these additional predictors of HBAR's price in addition to just this time expectation, this logarithmic growth curve over here. And there's some other factors I've included in the model also to take more into account how, for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum's price might predict HBAR's price differently at different points in time. But generally speaking, the long and short of this model is we're using Bitcoin's price, Ethereum's price, and time to predict HBAR's price. And what you can see is it does a pretty good job. It's following, HBAR's price quite a bit more closely than the mere time-based version. And there's going to be times, where HBAR is underperforming that fair value, or it's overperforming that fair value, and it generally kind of comes back towards center. And there's some different things that we can observe from this. So first of all, if we just draw our attention to current price action, we're actually basically right where we'd expect HBAR's price to be based on what Bitcoin and Ethereum have been doing when you include them in the model. They have been falling off a cliff, and when Bitcoin and Ethereum are falling off a cliff, you would expect HBAR to also fall off a cliff as well, given that they tend to be highly correlated. So currently, the model actually thinks that HBAR is about almost exactly where we'd expect it to be based on this model that accounts for Bitcoin and Ethereum's price action. So another thing that we can also mention, though, just looking at this, that does seem like historically overall, HBAR kind of does what you'd expect it to do based on what ETH, Bitcoin, and then also including that time, general logarithmic curve expectation, what all those things would predict. That, as the markets rise with Bitcoin and Ethereum, generally speaking, then HBAR will be following in pretty close lockstep. As the markets fall, HBAR will also fall in lockstep, rise, fall, etc. And this is something that I've said a lot about different altcoins, but I think it bears repeating here again. For a lot of altcoins, their fate is not their own. For a lot of them, they're really dependent on broader market conditions. And Bitcoin and Ethereum really oftentimes dictate those broader conditions. They really kind of set the tone for what is likely to be happening in the market. Are we in a bear market? Are we in a bull market? So it actually makes a lot of sense that HBAR has been following along. And I think this will continue to be the case until HBAR is really able to differentiate itself from other crypto assets. And that would really come from, in my opinion, adoption. If HBAR can start getting, for example, big enterprise adoption of, the hash graph, if they can get, a big DeFi ecosystem, or even other use cases like carbon credit exchanges like they've talked about, things like that, that might actually help it break this correlation and have it not be so dependent on what Bitcoin and Ethereum are doing. But until we get there, I think this will continue to be the case. And so looking at this model actually gives us a good idea of where we should expect HBAR to be. And really, occasionally HBAR can put big runs in above this fair value, but by and large, it tracks it fairly closely. And so, really what this would mean is that we'd like to see Bitcoin and Ethereum start to recover, show some strength, then think that HBAR will likely go along as well. It could have these kind of moments where it pops up, but those are kind of the exceptions rather than the rule that it's doing that. Now, one thing I did want to talk about with this model is that you might look at this and say, okay, but is this just an overfit model, right? This has full knowledge of HBAR's price and, all of these predictors all the time. Is this something that just looks kind of good when it has all the data, but would fall apart if it tries to predict future values without knowing what HBAR's price would be? So the way that you can test for this, or to look and see how overfit a model seems to be, is by just splitting kind of the data into a training set and a test set. And so that's what I've done in this model here, is that everything from around March 19th, this is 80% of all the data. That's a common cutoff people will use. You use the first 80% to fit the model and then predict the following 20%. So that's what I've done here basically. So 80% of the price data is roughly March 19th. So that's what this cutoff here. And then, everything beyond this is just being predicted by time, the ETH price and the Bitcoin price without knowing what HBAR's price is. This is what it's predicting throughout there. And you see that it's a fairly similar fit to what we were just seeing with the full model. So I don't think this model is especially overfit. I think it's a reasonable gauge to look at to predict what HBAR's price might be right now. So that's the model that we're looking at. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about. In terms of fair value, HBAR is actually about where we'd expect it to be. So, in terms of what Bitcoin and ETH are doing, it's not, in a case where it's so, extended to the downside that a big rally kind of to catch up is very likely. Something like we saw here where we're undervalued and really rallied hard to kind of catch up to that fair value. But that being said, that doesn't mean that HBAR has to dump right now, right? It's actually not all that common for HBAR to spend all that much time below the fair value. And then sometimes it spends time above the fair value line, then it actually goes on nice rallies into the future. But really kind of the main point I wanted to say here is we're kind of where we'd expect to be based on broader market conditions. But of course, we don't really care so much about where HBAR is relative to expectation for Bitcoin and Ethereum. We really care about where is HBAR relative to what we expect versus the dollar. What's its risk versus the dollar? So a different model we consult to answer that question is our risk model here at the channel, the upside downside potential indicator, that's looking at basically the risk of HBAR relative to the US dollar. And so what we can see is that overall, so I'm showing the long-term version of the model. This cares about moves that play out over months. And higher values are higher risk, so getting up towards 5. Lower values, lower risk, getting down towards -5. And you see the UDPI does a great job of quantifying risk, right? Low risk, high risk, low risk, high risk. And then we're down, as you can see now, back in a low risk zone. And that's where we've been for a little while. We can switch over to the raw output of the model just to see this a bit more clearly, right? Yellow is the HBAR price. White is the risk level across time. And we're actually down at the lowest levels of risk that we've seen with HBAR throughout its history, right? We were down at -4 all the way back here at the very beginning. Almost got down there, -3.6-ish over here. And now we actually went all the way down to -5 recently, into this big crash down here. And we kind of recovered a little bit of it as prices started to appreciate, but now we're rolling back down as prices move back down as well. So what's important to note here is that even though prices have largely gone sideways, you'll actually see that risk is not all the way back down at -5. And that means that there is still some realistic downside the model is pricing in. Basically, it's saying that the floor now is probably lower than it was back here, or the floor that it's looking at as a plausible amount of downside. Again, who knows? The crypto is crazy, markets are crazy. If we had a full-on stock market crash or something like that, then who knows how far HBAR could go. But the model thinks that there is still a little bit of, plausible long-term downside potential currently for HBAR. But really, if we are going to assume that we don't get some big black swan event, if we're going to assume that we don't get some kind of crazy stock market crash or something like that, beyond what we've already seen in the stock market, what this is really saying, and so not to miss the forest for the trees, is that this is a low risk point for HBAR, that there's a lot more plausible upside potential that the model's seeing than downside. And so, again, barring any of those kind of external factors, external shocks, crashing markets, this very well could be a point, a spectacular, accumulation zone that we might look back and see it, kind of like what we saw, back through here, or, obviously back over here. That was this kind of, I might compare it more to over here. We might see kind of extended period of accumulation. And then, obviously anyone buying in there would be quite happy to have bought there, given how high HBAR went up, that they then distribute it at these higher levels. So not financial advice, make of these data as you will. But, really what I wanted to say here is that with the fair value model, that's saying that HBAR's price is about where we'd expect it to be based on what the broader markets have been doing. But then if we're talking about amount of upside and downside potential, that seems plausible. HBAR is at a point where the model thinks a lot more upside than downside is realistic. So that's in the long term. I did just want to quickly show the short-term version of the model. This cares about moves that play out over days to weeks, so more short-term in its focus. And it's telling a similar story, right? We had realized more of our short-term upside potential in this kind of mini rally here, but now we're back down kind of at these same levels. We actually went all the way back down to -5 again, recently. Popped a little bit back up, which is just the model basically pricing in some more realistic short-term downside potential from current levels. But again, don't miss the forest for the trees, way more upside than downside potential right now. So if that's the case, right, then what might we be looking at for a change in the trend? So the fair value kind of analysis we did, we'll first want to be looking at what Bitcoin and Ethereum are doing. If they start recovering, that could be a green light for HBAR. But we can also just look at the trend that HBAR is showing us itself. And another model that we can look at that we have here on the channel is the market direction classifier, or MDC. So if you're not familiar, this is a trend indicator. Basically, it evaluates what the asset has been doing, in this case HBAR, and then it creates a critical level that I think HBAR needs to be above to be bullish, and if it's below, that's bearish. And you can see it does a pretty good job of quantifying these points when HBAR is generally trending up, when it's trending down, when it's moving up and it catches these upward moves very early, these down moves, up moves, down moves through here, got this bit of an up move, and now we're more or less kind of going sideways. And so what we may be looking for as another indicator of potential bullishness is, can we flip the MDC critical level, which is currently at about 6.6 cents. We're trading at around 6 cents as I record this. We have to make up a little bit of ground to get above that, but certainly within reach. And so for my overall evaluation of HBAR and where we are right now, I think there's some interesting things we can take away from these data that I've just talked about here. So with the fair value model, I think this kind of reinforces the idea that HBAR probably isn't going to go on a crazy rally without broader market conditions supporting it. And we see that very clearly with that fair value model. Now, without Bitcoin and Ethereum, moving up, it's very unlikely that HBAR is also going to move up. Or I should put it another way. The fair value of HBAR will rise as Bitcoin and Ethereum rise, and HBAR tends to follow that fair value line quite closely. So we'd like to see that happen going into the future. And then we also know from the risk analysis that barring any kind of external shocks, HBAR has stored up a lot of upside potential, right? We've had this horrible downtrend here, this massive drawdown. And throughout that whole time, HBAR, you can think of it as accruing upside potential. It's been kind of getting more and more favorable from a risk-reward perspective as we go. And so should we flip the MDC critical level, should Bitcoin and Ethereum start to reverse their bearish disposition, HBAR could be set for a very nice move. Now, again, that's all assuming that those market conditions happen. So that's why I think we just need to be watching that quite closely. But again, I think what this does say is that any possibility of HBAR just going ballistic on its own, probably not super likely in my opinion. So again, not financial advice, just make of the data as you will. I'm also curious to hear about your outlook for HBAR. Definitely post that in the comments. Curious to look at that as well. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates about indicators and more over there.